and welcome everybody joining us in person here at the British Library and also joining us remotely. It's fantastic to welcome you all to the British Library for this joint event between the Eccles Institute for the Americas and Oceania and the Fulbright Commission. I must remember to say this. If you're joining us remotely, we're very sorry you're not here with us in person, but we're delighted you're watching. And you do have an opportunity to contribute by asking questions. So you can ask a question on the link that you're watching. So please do start thinking about questions to send in, and we'll try and get to you. And of course, everybody here, you can definitely ask questions at the end by putting your hand up. It is fantastic that you're all here. My name is Polly Russell, and I'm the head of the Eccles Institute for the Americas and Oceania at the British Library. We are really pleased to see you all here tonight, but we're especially pleased to see the new cohort of Fulbright scholars joining us today at the beginning of what will be the most exciting journey of research, cultural exchange, and discovery. As you embark on your journey in the UK, I'd really love you to think about the British Library as a resource that you can draw from and that you are welcome to come and use. We're here for research, of course, for cultural events, and also just as a beautiful public space with great Wi-Fi that anyone can come and use. It's definitely worth exploring what's on offer at the library, including the Eccles Institute, which was set up around 30 years ago. It's responsible for building the national collection of Americas and Oceania content. We run an extensive fellowship scheme, including one wonderful Fulbright Fellow. We run a schools and learnings program, and also events, cultural events like this. So again, please look us up. Email us if you want to find out more, or just search us out at the British Library. To deliver our rich program of activities, we're really proud to work closely with organizations like the Fulbright. We share so many of the same values, a recognition of the importance of cultural exchange and a commitment to intellectual imagination and rigor. So we are thrilled to be co-hosting tonight's event, Connecting People with Science. Tonight's subject is especially true and relevant to the British Library. The library's recent 5-year strategy makes a commitment to prioritize public understandings of science and to develop this site as a major center for life science and data science research. Connecting this information with users of all types, researchers, specialists, and the general public, drives our science activities at the library. So I'm excited to hear tonight what this amazing panel of experts have to say, looking at this topic from the perspective of the UK and the USA. And I'm hugely grateful to Mariette, Director of the Fulbright Commission in the UK, for coming up with this idea in the first place. It's very important, of course, those of us involved in research, to credit people who come up with the ideas, and it was Mariette. And so I'm going to hand over to her now to say a few words and to introduce our panel and chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly, for your very warm welcome, and for the British Library and the Eccles Institute support for the Fulbright Commission for over many, many years. We are incredibly proud to be your partner and to be able to play a part in the British Library's mission of making your intellectual heritage, I'm quoting directly from the mission statement, accessible to everyone for research, enjoyment, and inspiration. And we do that, as Polly says, because we have our Eccles Fulbright Fellows who are doing research here. And I should add, our commission archives have been part of the British Library collection since 2018, and of course through this Fulbright Eccles event, which takes place every year. For us as a commission, this is a really special day in our calendar. First of all, as Polly has noted, because it takes place during the week that our American Fulbright postgraduate students and scholars arrive in London for their orientation and the beginning of their UK adventure. And we've just spent a day with them hearing about what they're going to do. And this gives us an opportunity. They've heard this. They've had us congratulate them many times over the day. But I think one more time, I really want to celebrate them here. A lot of their university sponsors are here. And so I think they deserve a round of applause for being here. So the second reason I always look forward to this event is because it exemplifies the kind of engaged dialogue and exchange that the US-UK Fulbright Commission is looking to foster on the difficult issues that face us as a global society. Tonight's panel discussion is entitled Connecting Science with People, because too often science and scientists have become disconnected from society at large. Whether it's artificial intelligence or genetic engineering or nanotechnology, these are powerful scientific advances that have social, political, and moral consequences. They affect all of us, and we all need to be engaged in their development. Alan Leshner is the former CEO of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, for the Advancement of Science, and a Fulbrighter. And he put it this way: scientists need to respect the public's perspective and concerns, even when we do not fully share them, and we need to develop a partnership that can respond to them. So this is the problem that civic society is addressing. And the solutions that it proposes, as we're going to be hearing shortly from our very distinguished panel, are not quick, they're not easy, they're messy, they're complex. They require leaving comfort zones behind to listen deeply to different perspectives and to collaborate meaningfully. And they aren't just directed at scientists. They require all of us to be involved. But this is exactly how learning happens and how transformational change happens. This is the power of civic science, which we refer to in the title. We at the Commission are incredibly proud to have been part of the Civic Science Fellows Program, which you'll be hearing about in a minute, from its very beginnings 5 years ago. And we couldn't have done that without the support of the Rita Allen Foundation. I'd like to take this moment to pay tribute to the Rita Allen Foundation and their chief executive, Elizabeth Christopherson, who I hope is listening in New Jersey, for spearheading the building of what is in effect a civic science movement in the United States. Undoubtedly inspiring work. I also want to thank them for sponsoring this evening's event and for supporting our 2 Fulbright Civic Science Fellows who are going to be our guides to tonight's discussion. So with that, let me introduce them. Clio Heslop is Head of Policy, Partnerships and Impact at the British Science Association, and as such leads the association's policy and stakeholder engagement team, working to influence organizations from policy, business, civil society, media, research, and education sectors. Clio was our inaugural Fulbright Civic Science Fellow in 2020, during which she was hosted, albeit remotely, thanks to COVID, by the University of Texas at Austin, where she researched partnerships between science and civil society organizations and US public attitudes to science communication and political decision-making. Melanie Brown is an award-winning science journalist who is the series producer for the BBC Radio's The Infinite Monkey Cage. She served as the Civic Science Storytelling Fellow based at the University of Oregon's Center for Science Communication Research in 2022-23, where, among other things, she developed and taught a civic science storytelling course at the university and brought together students and the Latinx community to develop science programming in Spanish for regional rural audiences. As you can see, we're in wonderful hands. Over to you both.
Thank you, Mariette, and thank you, Polly, and yes, thank you all so much for coming to see us this evening. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. So, first of all, Mark Miodownik, who has worked as a material engineer in the UK, Ireland, and in the US. Today, he is the UCL Professor of Materials and Society, where he founded the UCL Institute of Making, which is linking arts and humanities with medicine, engineering, and materials science. Mark is also a hugely popular broadcaster on TV and radio, including the recent series Glued Up on BBC Radio 4, the author of books including Stuff Matters, which is a New York Times bestseller, and the brand new book, It's a Gas. And Mark also delivered the 2010 Royal Institution Christmas Lectures, which is one of the UK's most long-running and prestigious science communication events. So thank you very much for joining us, Mark.
Brilliant. And I'd like to... And now for Mariette. Mariette DiChristina. Hello, welcome.
Hello.
Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you.
Mariette has spent 3 decades as a science journalist, culminating in 10 years as the first female editor-in-chief of Scientific American. Today, she is Dean of Boston University's College of Communication and Professor of Practice in Journalism. And she also sits on the Civic Science Advisory Committee that supports the Civic Science Fellows Network that Clio and I were part of. Mariette, it's really fantastic to have you here joining us in person, so thank you. So, this is a good jumping off point. So no beating about the bush, let's get to it. Civic science isn't really a household term. Tell us, Mariette, what does it mean to you and why is it so important?
I was trying to think of a way to describe this so quickly, because I think people are very busy and things go by quickly, so we might as well try to get to it quickly, as you've already done, Melanie. And I think when you add the word civic to science, you put in the missing piece for science as it serves the public. So what you're doing there is making the connections that help scientists better serve their communities with their research. And why do we need it now? Well, Maria mentioned a number of challenging, multidisciplinary, really strident issues of the day, from climate change to public health to how do we incorporate AI, what are we going to do with things like CRISPR gene editing technology, where the answers aren't always what the science says. The answers are often what we decide to do together as a community, and that's where the civic comes in.
Right. And so thinking, you mentioned quite a few areas there, from sort of AI to medicine. Could you give me an example of when a sort of civic science approach to one of those would have made quite a significant difference?
Well, I think one thing it's easy to point at is the challenges about belief in climate change in the US, just as an example. When one end of the spectrum is talking about only what they see, and the others are talking about what they feel and what they believe, and you don't have a bridge in the middle, it's very easy, you can see, to become disjointed. And, for me, civic science works best when both sides are listening and both sides are acknowledging that facts and data are super important in the world, but so are things like belief systems, equitable access to different benefits of society. And when some of these things are missing, it's hard for people to come together.
So, Mark, turning to you, while we might be even less familiar with the term civic science in the UK, we do have this really strong and long-running culture of public engagement and participation, perhaps more so than in the USA, when, things that started long ago, 30, 40 years ago, some of these programs have been running. Can you talk a little bit about why you think it's so important to have that public voice in science here, and maybe reflect on what led you to start doing civic science, even though you may not be calling it that yet?
Well, I think, it's important because science is part of culture, and I think, over the years, especially the 20th century, I think it kind of sort of siloed itself. That was my impression coming into science. Of it's a special place, a special body of knowledge that's different from all the others, and it's done by mostly men, turns out, and they kind of do it in their own particular way and don't bother them, and leave us alone and we'll give you brilliance and riches but that's the deal. And I think as the 20th century progressed and kind of there was the techno-optimism kind of faded and some of the kind of really big impacts of science and technology started to hit people's everyday lives, and the kind of promised land of leave us alone and we'll give you everything, started to feel a little bit, let's say, like it being sold something that wasn't really coming to pass. I think the public really were very thirsty to be involved. And yet the culture of science, decades of was, well, but we don't talk to you, we talk to each other. And so I think that's what Britain did, increasingly 70s, 80s, 90s. And when I sort of started participating at the turn of this century, I really could see very clearly that part of my job as being an academic and a scientist was to be part of the cultural debate. And in France, they have things called public intellectuals, and there's a kind of permission to talk in a particular way to everyone. And I think we've had to gain that permission in the UK. And I'm not sure we're fully there yet, to be honest. It's been chipping away at it. I think these kind of silos, people cling on to them because you don't want to be part of a team, a gang. And it's kind of, in a way, you define your gang by what you're not. And I think it's quite easy to define yourself as not a techie, nerdy person. And so, it's not just the scientists, I think, who kind of siloed themselves. I think everyone else was quite happy, And so it's taken a long time. And I think breaking down those silos is the only way to solve the complex problems, because we live in a world now where science and technology really, unless we all participate, we won't find the complex compromises between what is possible and what we're going to do. And how we're going to remediate, and how we're going to bring in the people who are worst affected, and how we're going to make sure that they are supported. I think it's no longer good enough for scientists to be ignorant of that stuff. Like, they can't just do science and go, well, it's not my job. It is their job. So I think that's the UK kind of scene as I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you point to any kind of benefits you've seen in your own work or your own research from working in this way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I started out early 2000s building my lab, and actually it's very, very hard to attract the brightest students to my lab, because A, I was new, and B, all the bright people, as I saw who I wanted to come in, they had other destinations, like, in London, for instance, they go into finance, or they go into the arts, or they go into humanities. Science wasn't the destination where it felt like a place to kind of have a really fulfilling life. It felt like the place that you went if you couldn't do anything else. Do you know what I mean? And I was like, oh my God, I need these people in my lab, but how do I get them in my lab? How do I even get their attention? And I quite quickly realized that the way to have it, to wave my hand and say, hello, actually we're doing really interesting stuff in materials over here, and everything's made of something, and it's everything from fashion all the way to spacecraft, and it's so come. And I thought, so the only way to really make that was to get into public engagement, and so I went. Also, I enjoyed doing it, and so yeah, that was my way in.
Yeah, great. I'm going to pick up on some of that, actually, and we want to talk a little bit about those national cultures of science and society in the UK and the US, and some of the similarities and differences. And yeah, I completely agree with you that in the UK, science can feel a bit separate from daily life, and people think of it as something, oh, that's jolly good, but not really for me, it just happens over there, or they don't really take a stance. Whereas my experience of the US was maybe people do take a bit more of a view, there's a bit less of that ambivalence, but sometimes with that comes a bit of polarization, and I know we'll talk a bit later about some of that kind of trust in politics piece. But Mariette, have I got that wrong? Is it the case that in daily life people are much more kind of in or out of science?
Well, of course, the US is a large place with a lot of things that go on in it, like the UK as well. But it's interesting you raised this separation that Mark's raised, because I remember one of our representatives for many years in New Jersey and Princeton, a guy named Rush Holt, who was a physicist by training. And I was with him at an event that the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, did for incoming fellows, which I was at the time. And he spoke about this separation. He said that he thought that the Sputnik era in the US showed people that science was for scientists. And if you weren't one of the cool kids of science, maybe you weren't necessarily invited. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I'm sure there's a flavor of it in places. But what I see in every study after study from Pew, for instance, and others, is that in the US, people have a lot of trust in science, We just don't necessarily know who the scientists are. I think Pew recently, in the last couple of years, had a study that 73% of Americans could not name a living scientist. You know, they might name people like Stephen Hawking or Einstein. These are people who are not around anymore. Part of that, I think, is a sheer numbers game. Fewer than 5% of the US are working scientists. And part of it is that in the past, as Marcus rightly pointed out, people felt like they didn't necessarily have permission to be speaking on public stages about science. But there's been a realization, especially in recent years, and especially, I would say, among earlier career researchers who know this to be true, that if you deprive, from your school committee to the legislators in DC, if you deprive them of the insights of people who are knowledgeable in science, then how are they to understand the compromises and choices they're going to be making, as Mark was pointing out. So, yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned those two divides, because obviously science journalism, in a way, should be helping bring the society and scientists together. So it would be nice to sort of focus on that a little bit. And it's funny, my first sort of experience in the USA when I arrived at my fellowship was getting a taxi at the airport in Eugene, Oregon. And this taxi driver said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I explained, and then she told me she didn't believe in science, and that the COVID vaccine was a plan to kill us, led by the global elite. And honestly, it was quite sobering and quite a shocking experience, in a sense, to sort of come face to face with the things maybe you hear about, but then to have that sort of vocalized by someone. And it really highlighted the challenges we face as science communicators, when even the word sort of science seems to polarize. And so I had to remind, when I was sort of going through my year thinking about all of these things. But I mean, it's fairly easy to engage people interested in science with science-related media. But I think there is a big challenge making science meaningful and beneficial and explaining the benefits for those perhaps more skeptical or underserved communities. So I was wondering, how are you seeing, what's happening in the US to sort of address this?
So before you, I mean, one of the challenges here, and you sort of not use the term, Melanie, but I think it's floating in the air, is this idea that we used to have about, called deficit model of communicating science. If only I could explain it to you, and if only I could make it fun and interesting, then you would believe it, right? But in the past, when people followed the advice of Dr. Fauci about getting their vaccines, it wasn't because they had read all the studies and understood the data. It was because they'd made an assessment and said, okay, this is a person that I believe he is a physician, I believe he cares about well-being, and therefore I will trust his judgment. So the first thing that has to happen, and I think this is really imbued in the principles of civic science, is you're listening before you're engaging, that you're actually having a two-way conversation like you and I are doing now, rather than making pronouncements and expecting people to believe it. Because that person who felt that there was a plant, or maybe they were chips. I heard chips were in the vaccines at one point, and I had family members asking me, was this done on purpose? And let's face it, at the beginning, it was really unclear. So unclear that the WHO called it an infodemic alongside the pandemic. Just some facts out there, trustworthy, some not trustworthy. So here's where it makes so much sense to follow some of the principles of truly engaging. One of them is listening first and understanding the person's perspective and appreciating that, although that perspective may not be illuminated by science, there is a reason for it, and understanding that and finding some shared common ground, then you can begin a conversation with them. So yeah, I mean, but the truth is a lot of people are when they're presented with opportunities to engage with science, really find them enjoyable and interesting. They just don't necessarily buy all of it.
And so how do you think the media is adapting to what you've said, sort of away from the deficit model and more towards dialogue?
One thing I love to see is something that's starting to be called, at least in the US, civic science media. These are collaborative projects, and there are many of them. One that springs to mind is in Louisiana with the University of Louisiana. There are journalists who are collecting information about flooding and tides and sharing it with, and getting that from the researchers and then sharing it with the community. So they're working in partnership, active partnership with the researchers who are doing the work. And there are many flavors of this in the medical profession and elsewhere. And I see those collaborations springing up. On the journalism side, sometimes this is also called impact journalism or solutions journalism. So using a lot of different terms here, but the truth of it is the partnerships between experts and non-experts to serve the community.
Thank you. And Mark, you've been a sort of public face and voice in science for many years. When you're conducting research in an area that has like a direct societal impact, how have you found dealing with the media? Have you noticed sort of any shifts in how the media reports on the science you're doing?
Yeah, I suppose, well, so at the moment I'm doing quite a lot of work in plastic waste, and that's an area that there's a lot of interest in our results. And I think it's kind of, one of the problems we have is that it takes a long time to get results that are, where all the data has been, collected properly and peer reviewed, and that's years. And but the problem itself goes through these cycles of politicization, which means that journalists come to you and say, "There's this thing that this politician said, and what do you think about that? How does it affect your does your work?" And of course, you want to join the conversation if you're me, because I'm like, we have to be part of the conversation. We're scientists, we're doing the work, so I want to be part of this conversation. But I can't point to the data because I haven't published it yet. And also I know what it's saying, so it finds its way into kind of some of my answers, I suppose. And so I think that kind of it's where I feel comfortable, and where I guess the journalism is comfortable in kind of being in the grey area, which I think is the challenge. And I think actually there's lots of, it's that kind of thing where you say, I'm going to say this, but I trust you, the journalist, to report it in a way that's contextualized in my doubts or my, we haven't. And I think it's that trust between the people in the media that you talk to, and you, the more you trust that they're not going to just take a little sentence and go big with it, the more you feel you can continue that relationship and make it a kind of back and forth, which I think is a healthy one. So I suppose it kind of means that's what's happening, or at least that's what I'm trying to do. But the other side, of course, it takes up a lot more time, because it's not just a single interview and off you go. It's actually back and forth, and you're constantly getting calls about this. And I had one the other day. Like, I've been to this thing in Malaysia. I've got some footage. It's about plastic waste. I can see British supermarkets on it. Can you look at the footage, please, and just tell me if this is illegal? And like,
wow.
What do I do with that? Do I say yes? Because I need to, I feel I want to be part of that conversation, and that's in the public. It's in the public interest, and here's a very, good journalist doing undercover work, but it's going to take a lot of my time, and like, is that the best use of my time? So these are the things that we have to kind of, I guess, work out how to do.
Just while we're on this kind of topic of that kind of media and cultural engagement with science, I was wondering about kind of in a slightly broader sense, there's lots of different creative and cultural ways to access science through comedy, entertainment, exhibitions, all sorts of things. But given we're here in the library, I wondered if you have any reflections on what roles libraries might play as kind of locally embedded institutions and community spaces, and as we heard from Polly, places that could become much more of a space for scientific discussions. That's for either of you, if you've got any thoughts or reflections.
Well, I'll just start to say that, so I come from a university these days, and I think that has me very much of a mind of how much libraries are a place that serve everybody, and they're a great space for convening. The resources of knowledge are there for the backgrounds if you need it. We were all gathered here today to talk about things that are meaningful to us and important to us. And I would love to see libraries often at the table where they're bringing people together who wouldn't normally maybe come together, because this is a place where people do that. And I think it's a terrific opportunity, and I think it's already happening. And there's only one direction of up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. 100%.
Great. And I wanted to talk a little bit to you, Mariette, about the Civic Science Fellows Initiative in particular, and this idea of building a network of leaders across the US and with input from the UK as well, of course. But what I really was struck by is the inclusivity of that community, and lots of things like ethics of technology and open environmental data is all kind of included in this conversation, and it's become really broad and really rich, and all these kind of connections and networks are forming. So I just wanted to ask your reflections on what it's adding to the landscape over there, and yeah, what kind of how that conversation is evolving.
Clio, I love the word landscape. So I'm going to tell you a quick story, and then how I came to appreciate civic science before I had the words, and then I'm going to answer the question about some of the things I really like that I'm seeing in the US now. About 2016, way before I knew of these efforts, before the first cohorts launched, was a researcher that I met at MIT named Kevin Esvelt. And so I've spent my entire career helping to try to make science accessible, working directly with wonderful researchers like Mark, who were very patient and giving of their time for their stories. And so I was talking to Kevin about his latest research, and he was working on CRISPR gene editing technologies. And he had an idea that he just began working on, which was, these technologies could be used for good or ill. It kind of haunted him that he might not have the whole picture of it. And nearby, he's at MIT, but nearby on an island called Nantucket, there's a disease called Lyme disease. It's bacterially caused in the blood of white-footed mice, and then also in deer in different life stages. And I think that island is number 2 or 3 in the US for all infectious cases of Lyme disease, so it's very serious. And he had this idea of could we researchers work with the community and gene edit the mice so they wouldn't transmit the Lyme bacteria anymore. He said, but I don't want to do a thing. This was back in 2016. I don't want to do a thing unless the community is interested. So he went and had conversations with them. And to Mark's point, it takes a while. In 2022, the community finally agreed this would be a great thing to test. So you can see how many years that took. But my instant response to his ambition at the time was, oh my goodness, this is the thing I have always wanted to see that was missing, these sort of active, ongoing conversations. So what do I like that I see? Well, since then, we now have this wonderful Civic Science Fellows program. The Reed Allen Foundation has been doing an amazing work, but lots of other funders too in the US, Burroughs Wellcome, Kavli, Dana Foundation, I could go on. And they have done a lot of landscape pieces of work to add to the puzzle. For instance, what does the landscape look like of art and science collaborations was a project. Or what does the landscape look like of training opportunities for science engagement for researchers? What does the landscape look like of other sorts of opportunities? And then they have put these pieces together with wonderful fellows like yourselves who are cohort by cohort creating leadership among the communities that they serve in their different ways. And I think that's why I feel a momentum. I mean, I've been mentioned more than 30 years, more than 35 now, but I feel a momentum in this area that I have never felt in my entire career until now. So it feels very exciting. I hope I answered your question. It was probably more than you wanted.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Mark, listening to Mariette there, do you think, I wish we had something like this in the UK?
I mean,
some sort of term to coalesce under?
Yeah, I think the UK is sort of ready, we have this thing called citizen science. I mean, it's not the same as what you're saying, because it tends to be online, mostly data gathering, which involves all citizens, and everyone can join in. So we have things like the butterfly count, and that everyone has to count butterflies, and you all put them in the app. And then we realize, oh no, they're disappearing, or birds, or basically all the news is bad. But at least we got good data, and the truth of that data is that it's the only way to get that data. That's the beauty of this citizen science, is that no scientist could do it. No amount of funding would get you to the Hebrides and to Wales and to Cornwall and to a London suburb and get data on one day. So it's a fantastic way of engaging people, but they are disparate from each other, they're not talking to each other, and that's one day and it's gone in a way. So what you're talking about sounds to me maybe the next stage that we need to encourage more of, which is, I think, you know, a local, you know, Nantucket was at the island. I mean, these issues around the local, where it's an issue that people really care about and they can own. And I think the nearest we've got is the water problems that we've got. So basically sewage been going into the rivers, and that's really been led by, not by scientists actually, by community people, but they have engaged with scientists to get the data. And I think, so I think we are probably going in that direction, but there isn't a funding body or anyone sort of, in a sense, I don't know, curating it, which would always be welcome. But I think it is inevitable that with these complex problems, if you start with what people care about and not start about your hobby horse, like, what do people care about? And I think that's really what I've learned with my science, is like, do the science that is important to society, and then of course, society has a lot of opinions about it, and you have to spend a lot of time listening to those and gathering data to understand what the research question is. So it's not like, oh, I have a research question and now I'm going to come and talk to you about it. It's like, we're going to do some work in plastic waste. What is the big problem? Where do you see it? And that unfortunately, the timescales just get longer and longer to do credible, meaningful work. But it is much more meaningful to me than sort of just applying for something that I want to do and just go and do. Yeah.
That's interesting. You mentioned the water, water and water pollution, because that's obviously quite a salient issue in the UK. And when I was in Oregon, wildfires was one of the issues I was sort of dealing with, like as a subject, but also just every day. Sometimes you'd leave the house and it would be yellow and acrid, and you'd have to wear a mask. And it was, it's very interesting to experience that. And I met with firefighters, wildland firefighters. I went and met with researchers studying fire, but I also visited local communities, and it was really interesting to be part of those discussions and actually hear what the concerns were from those people. And you're right, they weren't always the same as the concerns or the focus of some of the research. So it's interesting to see how those can be blended together. But it was really heartening as well to see those discussions happening and to see some of the creativity, Clio, that you mentioned coming into things, so seeing the arts and the role of that and technology. I saw a fascinating project where they were collecting interviews from people, but also photos, poems, artworks, and they were developing a sort of geographic map that you could look at that would tell these fire stories from the region over time with some archive, but also from the present day, so you could get a real sense of what let's say burning issues, that'd be bad, what the issues were of the moment. And you mentioned that you'd done some citizen science work yourself. I was kind of interested maybe in some of the challenges and opportunities you see there. Yeah, well, so the one that worked the best that we did was called the Big Compost Experiment. And I'm a bit of an obsessive about compost, but basically, if you want to know the best thing you can do with your waste, like the biggest impact you can have at home to do with waste is not to put food waste in the black bin. That's the biggest impact. Forget recycling. That's not a bad thing to do, but the biggest impact you can have is to not put, and to separate it. And if you have a home compost, to compost it, or at least get someone else to compost it. Anyway, so we're interested in the claims made by companies who are making compostable plastics and biodegradable plastics, that if you did that, use those bags and put them into your compost at home, so it's your garden, do they work? And so we got people to do this experiment across the whole country. We had thousands of people doing this in their own back gardens. Now, we couldn't go to their back gardens, so they took photos of their own compost heaps, and we loved that, of course. We're like, yes, well done. and we asked them what their opinions were, and did they go out and buy these things specially? And we had all this data, but best of all, we had them putting a bag. You could see their hand. Here's the product. Here's my compost. Take a photo of it. And then 3 months later, we'd remind them, could you just go and have a look?
And then 6 months later, we remind them, can you have a look again? And then 12 months later. And so we had the only data set in the world which was actually matching the claims of the companies to the end result. And the end result was, they don't work. And we had it clear cut. It was so clear, the data. It was so unambiguous. And that's when you think, okay, we did a good thing. We did a good thing, and we really hope the companies would go, oh my God, it doesn't work. We're going to reformulate them and not ignore this data. That didn't go so well. That's another story. But anyway, yeah, I mean, that is where we came headlong in terms of the media reporting of it in conflict with, because I had this naive idea that the data would be sacred. Like once we'd done the data and we peer reviewed, and it went through a very rigorous peer review, we thought, well, that's, done then. But of course, that was very naive. And so I've learned from that. But I think that I sort of, it was great, and we now have that cohort of people who interact with us, thousands of people who now follow our work and in other plastic waste, and we're going to do a project on nappies and period products and incontinence products, which is another big area of claims and counterclaims, and I think we're sort of building. What I like about it is that we are building this cohort of public who are actively contributing data, seeing the data and compiling it up in a transparent way, seeing it go through peer review, seeing the science at work, us, and then seeing the kind of what actually, comes out. Does that elicit change? And I think in the case of biodegradable plastics, it hasn't elicited any change because people believe that they're a good thing. It's a belief system. It is a belief system, unfortunately, including a lot of the manufacturers. They believe it, even though they've seen our data. And I think that's like a really hard for me to take as a scientist. I'm like, but if it's a belief system, what hope do we have, of changing people's minds? And now I feel like it's actually about chipping away, about kind of just keeping my head, not throwing the baby out with the pram.
Well, I mean, I agree. I do think it's about chipping away, and I think when you've invested that time, you build trust, and that's how we come to shift on those belief systems, right? We come to trust somebody's opinion or trust what we've learned, and then maybe we're a little faster in the future if we've done it right. Yeah. But it does take time. Yeah.
And the comms around it takes a lot of energy.
Yeah.
And a lot of emotional energy. That's one of the because actually, basically, we got a lot of pushback from some of the manufacturers. Like we'd manipulated the data, and we're like, honestly, the data's on the website. Like they can see all the raw data, and it's from thousands of people. Like we're going to go to different, it seems incredible, but that was the accusation. But also, it really hurt. And you go home and you kind of go, damn it. And so by putting yourself out there and by doing these things very publicly and therefore getting the kind of pushback, you have to take on a lot on board. And it's a lot harder than if you just go to a lab, close your doors, do your work for 3 or 4 years, lob the paper over the wall, tell people, this is what we've been doing, aren't we brilliant? So it feels to me like the civic science is just it requires a lot more of the scientists and engineers to be both emotionally engaged and to talk and to dialogue, none of which is rewarded explicitly within our job descriptions, right? So you're kind of, in a way, if you think about, you have a colleague who's not doing it and you're doing it, and you can see them maybe getting promoted or whatever, it can get to you, right? It's not a massive incentive unless you're absolutely wedded to this and think you're looking for meaning, and I guess you want it to be, I guess I think this is the only way to do science, sort of. But if you're not of that mindset, it's hard to see other modes flourishing, let's say. So when you say what change do we need in the UK, I feel like what we need is some of the funders to go, this civic world where we need to build trust and partnerships is going to take time, and we're going to be patient, and we're going to allow that time and invest in people for longer, especially young researchers. Because for me, it doesn't really matter that I'm not a prolific publisher of our work. I've got the privilege of being established. But for young researchers, that really isn't the case. And so it's an invidious choice, really. Like, do you do it the proper way, slowly and surely, and with partnerships and trust and building communities, or do you, in a sense, ignore it and go for the kind of slightly more closed off? I mean, I'm being too kind of...
Well, my sense is that the incentives are catching up.
Slowly changing.
They're getting it. And so the other thing that's happened here is that you've preempted almost all of the questions I was going to ask.
Sorry.
Which are about communications and narrative and relatability and trust and how they all relate to each other and play into each other. But Mariette, I was going to ask for your reflections, and particularly that idea of a more strategic approach to communication and telling those stories, and how that can build trust, not only with the public, but potentially with partners or stakeholders that might not quite like what they're seeing.
Yeah, I first want to give a bit of praise to you, Mark, for sticking with it. It sounds like those are challenging lessons to learn, and also to point out that some of the funders are, National Science Foundation, for instance, in the US, are now making, rewarding to some extent with additional money if you've got a plan for that communication. And also to say that, I think of these things, and then I'll come on to it, as a bit of a portfolio. For one person, maybe it's more of a challenge. For another, I was just reading an essay in Science about why researchers shouldn't have to pick between public engagement and their research. Because for some people, they're feeling included, more personally engaged. So there are rewards to it sometimes also, even though it's additional work. So I just want to give him a, that was great to learn about and appreciate it. I'm sorry, but you were asking me about, you were asking me about, well, you say again, sorry.
Oh, yeah, of course. I was asking about that strategic communication.
Yes, thank you.
We've seen a lot of amazing work and research coming out of the US. We were talking about
I so appreciate that.
Work.
Yeah, Anthony Dudo and John Beasley have a book out recently on the science of science communication, which I'm a big admirer of. And among the lessons in that book are, first of all, if strategic science communication isn't just, I'm going to enlighten you. It is you would have a goal for the communication in mind. For instance, maybe you want people to make a decision about how AI is applied in schools. I don't know. I just made that up. Or maybe you want people to vote for something because it will benefit them, and you need to explain the communication to see the impact of that action. But one of the things that book in particular did, and you could speak to this as well, Clio, is it explained a lot of the things that the researcher needs before trying to make it accessible or fun with science and art, or engaging with new visual storytelling techniques, before that. And this is some of the things we've touched on here: developing trust, listening with humility, having empathy and warmth. Warmth counts for a lot when you're trying to connect with people, whether they agree with you or not, but they'll listen longer if they feel like they like you and they're being heard.
Also,
yeah, please.
No, you absolutely. And then one of the other things that I came across, which I think actually is more of a challenge for the scientists, and I've definitely seen the car crashes like this, which is like respect, mutual respect between the citizens who, it's quite, someone says to you it's a hoax, like, or it's quite hard to maintain respect in this communication, right? But but everyone can whiff when someone's not respecting them, right? So we're very attuned to disrespect, and then essentially the communication's over, right? But so it's really hard to go, well, you don't know what you're talking about, or it's really hard, right? And I've seen it in research projects where we have, it's not the public involved, but the multidisciplines. So we've had sort of, English and history and social scientists. In fact, we do it in ours with, quantitative scientists. And we have after a few weeks, we realize that some of the people on the team don't think that the other people's stuff is worth much. And everyone feels it, and then it's over really, like, because, so that building of respect across this divide, sometimes of ignorance, as you might think it or I might think it, but how do you get the warmth and the kind of listening? And it's a real challenge, especially to someone who lives and breathes quantitative facts and just cannot put up with any crap. Then what how do you train people, or how do you get the capability of not just communicating your disrespect for that person?
Yeah. So I appreciate what you're saying a lot. I often reflect on, and maybe it's a little easier as a journalist because I am by my nature not the expert in the room, but I always try to remember that the person probably knows things I don't know.
Yeah.
And so I usually, when I don't know what to say, and again, maybe this is a journalist, I'll say, what makes you feel that way? If somebody says, the thing has an injection, it's trying to take over my mind or whatever it is, I'll say, what makes you think that?
Yeah.
Where'd you hear that?
But it's the
and
tone
I
in
just
your
ask
voice.
them a few questions.
I can see that would work.
Yeah.
If I say, what makes you think that?
Yeah, well,
genuine
curiosity
but you've got
really makes it, and you do too, but you're being modest. But genuine curiosity really makes, so you should go into a communication with that kind of ready to go mindset, knowing that there might be objections, so anytime you're doing strategic communication, you should try to think through what are the kinds of questions people might have, what are the kinds of reactions they might have, what would make them upset about this research, what would make them happy about it, and try to think it through before you get there. That helps.
You're right.
That's fantastic advice, Mariette. And it's lovely having this discussion and learning from each other.
Clearly we're going to speak in the future, at least I hope so.
Yeah. And sort of following on from that and bringing sort of transatlantic perspectives, Mark, what do you think we in the UK could perhaps learn from the US? And Mariette, I will ask you the same question afterwards.
Well, I think that I just learned. I think the kind of the basic level of communication skills in the US is just very high, I think. And I don't know how Americans have managed to be so great at communicating right from birth, but it's definitely
show and tell maybe.
It's definitely my experience. So I think that we're catching up the whole time in Britain. It's a bit more reserved and a bit more circumspect, and not over. And warmth is it's in short supply sometimes in London anyway. So there is a lot to be learned on that front, and I think that's they call it soft skills here, which I think in a way, if you could just get rid of that term, it's not a soft skill, it's like an essential skill. Call it an essential skill. Don't call it a soft skill, because that sounds like it's a nice to have, and it's not a nice to have.
Thank you.
It's kind of hard sometimes.
And Mariette.
Yeah, I have to say, I've always admired about the UK, even when I'm watching TV. Science is part of the conversation, not as if it were a thing apart. So I wish we knew that better and more often. I also love seeing things like, and I'm not saying it's always done correctly, but application of social sciences to affect positive change. I don't know that we take a lesson on that in the US as often as we might. And I feel we would all benefit from that if we just embraced it a bit more. Like I said, in the US, we often admire science and scientists, but we don't feel like we know them. And it's still okay to say, I just don't, well, that's not for me. Yeah, I'm not a nerd, or I'm not that. And I wish we didn't feel that way. Yeah.
I think it's the same here.
Okay, well, from here, we'd actually like to open up and take some questions and ideas from you. And whether that is about civic science, about communication, about trust, about examples that you've seen. What we're going to do is we're going to start with one question from our online audience to give you all a bit of thinking time, and then we're going to come straight to the room to hear from you. So, Melanie, have you seen
I have.
online?
I'm whizzing through this iPad. So we have a question from Nicola, who is a scientist working in Oxford University in the area of nutrition. And she wants to know how scientists can best communicate science to the public when they're competing with folks who seem to present the science, but are in fact presenting an oversimplified narrative.
So I'm going to acknowledge first that that's not easy to do, because a simplified narrative is, you know, we're humans, we're busy, we're sorting out our days, we're thinking about what we're making for dinner, or hungry for pizza, you know, and somehow we're trying to fit the science in there, and I can appreciate that that's daunting. I mean, one thing I will often suggest to researchers, and Mark and I actually chatted about this before coming in, is if you're already doing some kind of engagement, I would not worry about doing all kinds of engagement, but just stick with the thing that you're comfortable with. If you like to post, you know, pictures of good meals, you know, that are great for nutrition on your Instagram, that might be a way, and knowing that your authority as a researcher there will put a little gloss on it, but it's a soft one. That might be one way to start to do that. But there is certainly a challenge with influencers who really don't know sometimes and make pronouncements, but there always were people who stood on soapboxes and people who were on the ground, and I think we're just going to have to keep talking and not stop or get frustrated because of it. You just have to keep at it.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Nicola.
Okay.
Should we go to the room?
Let's.
Yeah, I saw there was one at the back straight away, so let's go there first.
Be a mic
And then
coming
there's
to
another
you.
one on that row here as well.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating, and thank you all for your contributions. I work in linguistics, which is one of those disciplines that sort of sits at the nexus between humanities and sciences, and I was really struck listening to the conversation that even though it's the power of civic science, actually a lot of the conversation was round about concepts and terms and ideas from humanities. So whether that's belief systems or the power of storytelling or building rapport or how to do an interview, right, and how to build that warmth and trust, or writing poetry about, you know, a science-related issue. So I'm wondering, what's the role of the arts and humanities in all of this building those connections through science with communities? And do scientists during their undergraduate and postgraduate degrees need to do a compulsory humanities module that trains them about some of these issues? I'm just wondering if you might be able to speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So I just want to say I love your question. Thank you. I mean, I think we need to learn from the humanities and social sciences about these human behavioral issues. And I think we should be using them. I mean, I do admire some of the efforts that have been done in the UK. I think we could do that more. And I think, yeah, I think when it comes to mandatory training, I actually am aware of some conversations in the US. Now, I don't know if they'll be mandatory or not, but coming out with some kind of a position or explanation of what would be minimums required in other areas of STEM training. There are lots of programs offered, so there's a lot available, but you know, the problem Mark was just pointing out too, that you don't get rewarded for it. That is a challenge. That's one reason, for instance, my own college is working on a certificate in civic science communication. It'll be a master's certificate, and it's because I thought, well, and thanks to the Rita Allen Foundation, they agreed that it might be worth trying, that this was something you put on your CV. So when it comes to tenure and promotion, you at least have some kind of reward. So I think we also need to find ways to reward those behavioral sciences when they're applied. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so just on the plastic waste research, I mean, we already have lots of humanities researchers as part of our team, embedded in our team. And one of the things we said right from the beginning for the research funders was, we meet every week, all of the researchers round a table, all of them different disciplines. And
That's great.
Right at the beginning, the first week, you know, everyone's got different bits of the research to do. And so we just talk about it. And we don't know each other's methodologies because I'm not a linguist, you know, expert. But after 6 months of doing that, you know, it does take that long. You know, you want to be a linguist. You know, like you fall in love with the. You know, what's wonderful is that you learn by doing. You learn by listening to this expert who's in the room, but because the core of the project's all similar. So in the case of the linguists, you know, we're talking about the words around recycling and the words around composting. Turns out composting is a bad word for people that don't really understand what it is. and if you want to tell people what to do in their home with stuff, you don't need to tell them to compost it, because most people are not interested. You say put, just put in the food waste, put in the recycling. Like, it seems like a simple piece of conclusion, and it took many bits of you know, very careful research, lots of people, lots of surveys, a methodology I still can't get my head around, but we published papers on it, and as a team, and I think that's an immense privilege. So my reward is that that's why I'm in a university, isn't it? To be with other disciplines. Like, I don't want to just be in my own discipline, and I think that in a way so the hard thing is to get the funders to agree to fund all these different disciplines around the table. That's the hard thing. Once it's there, it's a total joy. And I guess that's what I feel. I would steer away from everything compulsory. I just feel like compulsory is something that will be great for 10% of the people who have to do it, and 90% will hate it, and you'll make them hate it for life. And I guess my approach, and it's just my personality too, probably, is that make it so fun that they want to do it. Like, just have more fun than everyone else, and then you don't need to make it compulsory. They'll just come and do it. So yeah, we have great lunches. We go for drinks. And
sounds fun.
That's the thing. Yeah.
Good motto for life as well. Just have more fun.
Yeah.
More fun.
Yeah.
Should we take another question?
Yeah.
What do you think? And I did say I would come to you at the back here, and then we'll go onto this corner.
Not a hands up.
Yeah, lots.
Thank you so much for your fascinating discussion. I'm a clinician scientist, and part of my work is on health literacy, so a lot of what you were saying really resonated with the medical side. My question was on social media, actually, and kind of harks back to when you were talking about the COVID vaccine, and also when you mentioned Instagram just now. Do you feel we should be embracing social media more as scientists, and should there be regulation as well in the social media space? What's your opinion on that?
I'll start, why not? On the regulation side, I mean, I have to say, in the past, there were these things called publishers, you know, and I worked for a magazine called Scientific American, and also with Nature here, and they had to check their facts before publishing, and they also had to make sure it wasn't libeling anybody and things like that. And I actually think when it comes to regulation, it would be a bad thing, in my view, to make the platforms a bit more accountable for the content. I understand the legal argument that they are just platforms, but frankly, they are publishing, and it's content that demonstrably has had some impacts, some of them not good, demonstrably not good to the public. So, and when people tell me, which they do, and again, I'm not a researcher here, right? But when people tell me, oh, it would be impossible for them to manage the facts on there a little bit, and there have been some experiments. I would say these are some of the largest and best financially, supported companies there are, and they should at least be trying. So regulation, I wouldn't mind. What I would usually say about social media, I mean, you can't do everything for everybody, which is why I usually advise only if you're already enjoying something and you really want to do that yourself, then great. I think that's super. If you're going to do that, it would be really swell if you would learn a little bit about what's best ways to present so that you'll be successful in those social media interactions. But it could be that you just like to speak at your school board or your town council gathering, and those are all valuable things to do. So I mean, you don't have to feel like you have to own all of social media. I would counsel you to just stick with the things you're most comfortable with.
Mark? Yeah, I mean, I think that's fantastic advice, and I definitely say don't do it unless you feel that you have a desperate need to do it, because it's going to take up a lot of emotional energy. It is, because I can't tell you how many times I've gone to bed, and there's been done a post, and there's been just loads of sort of, let's say, likes, and then one person has just said, and they're probably a lunatic, I mean, but I'm carrying it to bed. I mean, God's sake, what am I like? You just ignore it, but you can't ignore it because it somehow stung you. And so unless you can do that, unless you're happy to kind of weather those storms, the upside is better than that. You know, it is worth it because you've got this thing you really need to say, and this is the right platform to say it, and it's the right community that you're trying to build, because it is a community online. And I think I've really benefited. You know, I mean, like all of the journalism stuff, you know, all the BBC stuff, you know, a lot of it has come because I'm out there doing stuff and I know the journalists and we're all on the same platform. I mean, that's really how it works, right? Because you very rarely come into physical contact with each other. So it's a very, very good way to kind of find your way into those communities, and they are very fantastic. But it does come with this downside that you have this an emotional commitment to having to take the downside. Yeah.
Great. I think we've got probably time for one more question from the audience. Or?
Yeah, should we do that?
Ooh.
I've chosen the last one. It's too much pressure for me.
Two more questions.
I think
we'll
the
just wait
mic's
for the
going to
mic
come
if
to you.
that's all right.
There you go.
Oh, two more. Good. Well done.
Okay, two more.
Thank you. That was great. I'm about to start a master's in synthetic biology, and so much of science is investigating and trying to understand what we don't know. How do you effectively communicate the unknowns and uncertainties of your research to the public while also not destroying the trust?
I love this
Great
question.
Great question.
Do you mind, Mark, if I just
go.
so quickly? I love this question because, you know, it's a feature, not a bug of science that we provisionally accept until we learn otherwise. And I'm often, I'm not a communication researcher, I should say. I'm a practitioner in journalism. But I often am stunned by how effective it is how I start the conversation. And the framing of that conversation. So I would start, if I'm just riffing on your point, I would say there's a lot we don't know about synthetic biology, but there's a lot we do know. I'm working in this particular area where the questions look like this. These are the things I'm uncertain about. But if you start right away that, you know, there's a lot we don't know, but then there's a lot we do, and give people a way to think about it, through it. So I think where we often struggle is where we just kind of go right into something without telling people how to start to think about it. And that's assuming that they are interested in listening, right, in the first place, which they may or may not be. But let's assume the audience is deeply interested and wants to know. And it's fair to tell them that right at the start. And then they'll trust you more because you were honest and maybe even a little bit vulnerable. And being a little bit vulnerable sometimes helps build that trust. And that's really important to any engagement that you want to do. And I say engagement, I mean that on purpose. It should be in two directions, you know, so they should have questions for you and feelings about synthetic biology, and you should listen to those.
Mark.
Yeah, the only thing I would say, it's a great question, is that don't forget that really the most powerful tool is storytelling. And
that's good.
So, right, so, and the unknowns, this is like a detective story. So you start off with this thing and you go, we have no idea why this happens. And, you know, and then you've got the audience hopefully into, so here's how I'm trying to work out whether this happens or not. And you build a story that is compelling. And that really, to a live audience particularly, you know, social media is different, but if you're doing anything, radio, TV, live audience, you've got to tell a really compelling story. And the unknowns are they're the thing, the hook, right? Because people love it when people don't know stuff. And if a demo goes wrong, like, oh my God, demos that go wrong, they're the best.
So I lied about having one. We can have one more.
Yeah, let's take this one. Let's take one of these. From here. Let's take this last one.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture today. So I'm about to begin an MPhil in medical science, and I think growing up through elementary school, high school, you learn science and you believe it right away. At least I did. I don't know. But getting further and further into the field, I've realized how much nuance there is sometimes. And I think that maybe a lot of the distrust kind of comes from an understanding of that nuance, but an inability to be able to evaluate what people are hearing. So I'm wondering, in your view, is the goal of civic science for a researcher or a scientist to be able to effectively communicate what they believe, or is it more so to equip the person that they're talking to with the ability to evaluate what they're hearing from a factual perspective?
So the goal of civic science is not one direction or the other, but both directions. The goal is to make sure that the communities that science serve get a voice in that science, so that the science best serves us all, so that we might, maybe the researchers will get some ideas about their research agenda that they didn't have before, for instance. So the goal is that it is bidirectional and cyclical with civic science, and the goal is to keep the conversation open, so those things we don't know or that we're thinking, we actually discuss, rather than letting one person think one thing and another person's thinking another thing, and meanwhile they're not on the same tracks at all. I love your question, because it's kind of getting to the heart of it. I think it's one of the reasons why things like the Civic Science Fellows program, where we imbue more of these skill sets in networks around the country and I hope around the world, ultimately are going to be the key, because it has to be we have to foster a culture to have it all move forward, not just one interaction or the other.
Yeah, that's the thing, and I think I personally feel like you have to sort of open yourself up to being in a world of doubt, and that's quite uncomfortable, and also listening a lot, not things that are kind of taught to you as a sort of straight science, and so that. It's not for everyone in a way, because it's difficult, uncomfortable, as I said before, but it's very rewarding too and meaningful. I think that's the other thing. So, is this a meaningful interaction, i.e. are both sides actually communicating with the other, and are we going to go together to try and find the solution? And if the answer is no, it's not civic science as I see it. It's actually manipulation. It's like, I know the answer, but I want you to come along with me, but I actually know the answer. But that is, you don't know the answer, because we're all going to have to come up with the answer together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely thought to end the discussion on there, Mark. So thank you so much. I want to just thank our audience for those fantastic questions and for coming here today to join us for this talk, and thank you also to the British Library and the Fulbright Commission for organising this. And I think, Polly, were you going to stand up and say a few final words? Thank you. Sorry, I caught you on the hoof there.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, wow, what a discussion, and thank you so much for giving such a compelling and engaging and also clear account of civic science as science in the service of community, for making the most wonderful pitch for libraries as spaces to research and also to listen, and this idea of listening. Thank you for elegant and fabulous chairing, both of you, just wonderful. But really thank you all as a panel for the work that you're doing in this really important sphere. And for doing it with such care, such consideration, and also making it sound so fun and so compelling, and making that important, communication and fun. This has been a wonderful and rich discussion. So can we thank this extraordinary panel? And I'd also like to say thank you to AV staff here, Unique Media, to the Eccles Institute team, and especially to Fulbright and all of the Fulbright team who've helped pull this together, and also to you for some of the best questions I've ever heard at any event at the British Library, and I have been to a lot. Yeah. So thank you so much, and here's to you new Fulbrighters having the most wonderful experience. Welcome and go forth. Thank you so much.